Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the video. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. It's August 8th, 2026, and today we're talking about how the US military just shattered Iran's blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, and the details coming out right now are honestly wild. For months, Iran has been trying to choke the most important choke point on the planet, and over the last 72 hours, that entire strategy has basically collapsed in front of everybody's eyes. We're going to break down exactly how this happened, what CENTCOM has been doing behind the scenes, why Iran is suddenly racing to the negotiating table with Oman, and what this means for oil prices, for the war, and for Iran's regime itself. And then we're going to get into the hardware, the mine clearing operations, the small boat swarm tactics Iran tried to use, and why none of it worked. Then we'll head into the global roundup section, because there's a lot happening with the Houthis in the Red Sea that connects directly back to this story. And then we'll close out with the 4D chess strategic analysis, because there's a bigger picture here that most people are not talking about. So stick around for that. Let's start with where things actually stand right now. Back in mid-June, the US and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding. Trump and Iranian President Pezeshkian put pen to paper on an agreement that declared the removal of the naval blockade, with Iran promising safe passage for commercial vessels through the strait for 60 days, no charge, while the future administration of Hormuz would get sorted out later with Oman and the other Gulf states at the table. For about a month, that actually held. Markets calmed down, oil prices eased, everybody exhaled a little bit. And then, like clockwork, Iran started testing the edges of that deal, and by mid-July, the whole thing fell apart. Iran resumed attacks on commercial vessels. Multiple Arab states got hit. And the United States, not wasting a single second, reimposed the blockade. Since that blockade went back into effect, CENTCOM has been putting out numbers every single day, and the numbers tell the real story here. As of the most recent count, U.S. naval forces have redirected 49 commercial vessels attempting to move in or out of Iranian ports. They've disabled 2 vessels outright. They've boarded 2 more, including that Comoros-flagged tanker, the MT Charminar, which got boarded back on July 25th and has basically become the poster child for what happens when you try to sneak product through this blockade. Only 8 ships crossed the strait on one recent Tuesday. Only 29 ships crossed in an entire week. Compare that to the roughly quarter of the world's oil and a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas that used to move through Hormuz before any of this started, and you start to understand just how completely the United States has strangled Iran's ability to move anything through that waterway. And here's the thing that Iran did not expect. They thought the blockade was going to be their leverage. They thought closing Hormuz, or at least making it too dangerous to use, was going to be the thing that forced Washington back to the table on their terms. Instead, it's the exact opposite. Iran's own economy is the one getting strangled. Every single day this blockade continues, Iran is losing what U.S. officials estimate at around $500 million every single day in lost oil revenue. Think about that number for a second. $500 million a day just evaporating because the regime picked a fight it could not and actually win at sea. And remember, this is a regime that's already dealing with a leadership vacuum after the strikes back in the spring, dealing with the economy that's been hammered by sanctions for years, and now dealing with a naval blockade that's basically bleeding them dry in real time. So it's no surprise that over the last week, we've seen a complete reversal in Iran's posture. Suddenly, Tehran is not talking about closing Hormuz forever. Suddenly, Tehran is sending negotiators to sit down with Oman and hash out a joint mechanism to manage the strait going forward. Iran's deputy foreign minister came out and said publicly that Iran and Oman are close to finalizing a proposed framework for commercial shipping through Hormuz. And President Trump, who has been saying for weeks that this thing would get resolved one way or another, came out on August 4th and said a deal could come as early as the next day. Reports out of Cairo and out of Qatari officials say drafts of a potential agreement are already circulating and are, in their words, in very progressive stages. Now here's where it gets interesting, because even while all of this diplomatic movement was happening, you had hardliners inside Iran's military still trying to posture like they've got leverage. Mohsen Rezai, who's a senior military advisor to Iran's supreme leader, went on Iranian state television and said Iran will not stand idly by and allow the naval blockade to continue. He said Iran will not allow any shipping route through Hormuz other than what he called Iran's own route. And then he said something that should tell you everything you need to know about how desperate this posture actually is. He said, if the United States brings warships into what he called the illegal route through the strait, Iran will target them. That's a direct threat against the United States Navy, coming from a guy whose own country's mine-laying fleet has already been sent to the bottom of the Persian Gulf. It's like watching somebody whose entire boxing team just got knocked out cold, still standing in the corner yelling that they're going to win the next round. At some point, you have to actually look at the scoreboard. So let's actually look at the scoreboard. because this is where the real story is, and this is the part that I think most people watching the headlines are missing. Go back to earlier this year. Iran's entire strategy for holding Hormuz hostage was built around small, fast boats, dozens of them, using them to lay sea mines throughout the strait. This is actually a smart tactic on paper. You don't need a navy to threaten the world's most important waterway. You just need cheap boats, some mines, and the willingness to use them. It's asymmetric warfare 101. Mine laying is a lot easier than minesweeping. You can literally push these things off the back of a speedboat with almost no training required. And for a while, it worked. It absolutely tanked shipping traffic. Insurance costs for tankers going through Hormuz spiked. Companies started rerouting entire fleets around the Cape of Good Hope just to avoid the strait altogether, adding weeks to shipping times and driving up costs on everything from gasoline to basic consumer goods. But then the United States Navy did exactly what you'd expect a superpower to do when somebody threatens the global economy with a fleet of speedboats. They found them and they sank them. CENTCOM confirmed striking 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels in an initial wave of attacks near the strait. And President Trump, never one to undersell a win, posted that all 28 of Iran's mine-dropper boats were sitting at the bottom of the sea. Whether the number was exactly 28 or not, independent verification on that specific figure was always going to be tough. But what wasn't in dispute is that Iran's ability to actively lay new mines got gutted almost overnight. And then Trump gave the order that really changed the calculus going forward. He told the Navy to shoot and kill any boat caught laying mines in the strait. Full stop, no warning shots, no hesitation. When you combine a standing shoot on sight order with a fleet that's already lost the overwhelming majority of its mine-laying capacity, you end up with exactly what we're seeing now, which is a regime that physically cannot project the kind of threat it needs to keep this blockade leverage alive. Now let's talk about what's actually left in the water, because mines that have already been laid don't just disappear because you sank the boats that dropped them. This is where the U.S. Navy's mine-countermeasures effort comes in, and it's honestly one of the more fascinating parts of this whole campaign. These mines aren't the classic spiky ball floating on the surface that you see in old war movies. Most of what Iran has been working with sits on the seabed or gets moored to it by a cable, floating just under the surface, and they can be triggered either by a change in water pressure when a ship passes overhead, or by picking up the acoustic signature of an engine. Finding something like that is slow, it's methodical, and it's genuinely dangerous work. It involves two phases. First, you've got mine hunting, which uses high-resolution sonar to actually locate individual mines on or near the seabed. Then you've got minesweeping, which uses mechanical or magnetic systems to trigger the mines safely from a distance rather than running into them. The Navy actually had decommissioned a lot of its dedicated minesweeping vessels in recent years, which sounds like a problem, except the Navy adapted by leaning on literal combat ships equipped for mine warfare, along with towed sonar arrays and AI-powered target recognition systems that can process sonar returns and flag likely mine contacts far faster than a human operator scanning a screen could ever do it alone. That's the real story of naval warfare in 2026. It's not just steel and gunpowder anymore, it's algorithms sorting through sonar noise to find a 200-pound explosive sitting on a seabed in the dark. And once those mines get located and neutralized, that's when you actually get to declare the strait clear. Not just militarily quiet, but physically safe for a fully loaded oil tanker to pass through without getting blown apart. And it's worth pointing out just how much risk the crews running this mission are actually taking on. Mine countermeasures work has always been one of the more thankless jobs in the entire Navy. You're not out there chasing down a visible target you can see on radar and engage from miles away. You're crawling along at slow speed through waters you know, for a fact, have live explosives sitting somewhere underneath you, trusting sonar returns and AI-flagged contacts to tell you where not to go. One wrong call, one mine that doesn't get flagged properly, and you're talking about a catastrophic loss right there in the strait. So every single day this operation runs without an incident is honestly a testament to how good these crews and this technology actually are. And that's part of why this entire campaign has taken the time it's taken. Nobody in the Navy is going to rush a mine-clearing operation just to hit some arbitrary political deadline, because the second you cut corners on something like that, you risk turning a diplomatic win into a humanitarian disaster with one single tanker explosion. So while Trump and the Iranian negotiators go back and forth on timelines in public, the actual operational tempo out on the water has stayed deliberate and methodical the entire time. And that discipline is exactly why we haven't seen a single mine strike a commercial vessel since this phase of the clearing operation kicked off. And that's exactly the phase we're in right now. Multiple reports over the last few days indicate the mine clearing operation has been running in parallel with the diplomatic track, which honestly makes total sense if you think about it from Washington's side. You don't want to sign a deal to reopen Hormuz and then have the first tanker that tries to use it get blown up because somebody forgot to finish the minesweeping. So while Reza is on state television making threats, and while negotiators in Muscat are hashing out the actual legal framework for how shipping traffic gets managed going forward, US, Navy assets are quietly doing the unglamorous, extremely technical work of making sure the water is actually safe to sail through. CENTCOM has continued putting out its own statement through all of this too, insisting that despite everything Iran has thrown at this waterway, the strait remains open and US forces continue operating there. That's a direct contradiction to what Reza and other hardliners in Tehran are claiming, and honestly, the fact that oil prices didn't spike into total chaos territory tells you which version of events the market actually believes. Brent crude has been sitting around $80 a barrel, which sounds like a lot until you remember where it was at the absolute peak of this conflict. $80 a barrel with hope of a deal on the table is a completely different economic reality than what we saw back when the strait was fully closed and prices were spiking well past that. Let's back up for a second and actually talk about why Hormuz matters so much in the first place. Because I think sometimes we throw around numbers like a fifth of the world's oil, and it doesn't really land until you break down what that actually means day to day. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and the actual shipping lanes that tankers use to navigate through it safely are even narrower than that, just a couple miles in each direction, one for inbound traffic and one for outbound. That's the entire artery the global energy economy runs through. There is no alternative route that can absorb that kind of volume overnight. Sure, you can reroute some cargo around the Cape of Good Hope, which is exactly what a lot of shippers started doing when this thing kicked off, but that adds somewhere around 2 to 3 weeks of extra transit time and millions of dollars in additional fuel costs per voyage. You can push some volume through pipelines that bypass the strait entirely, and Saudi Arabia has actually been doing exactly that, converting some of their gas liquid pipeline capacity over to crude oil service and pushing their east-west pipeline all the way up to a record 7 million barrels a day, well past what that pipeline was originally designed to handle. But even with all of that creative rerouting, none of it comes close to replacing the raw volume that used to move through Hormuz on a normal day. So when Iran threatened to shut this down, they weren't just threatening a regional inconvenience, they were threatening to put a chokehold directly on the global economy. And that's exactly why the response from Washington had to be this aggressive. You cannot let a regional power hold that kind of leverage over the entire planet's energy supply and just let it sit there unanswered. And that's really the context you need to understand what happened next, because everything the US did in response, sinking the mine-laying fleet, issuing the shoot on site order, running the mine-countermeasures campaign, reimposing the blockade on Iran's own ports as counter-leverage, all of it was built around one single objective, which was making the cost of keeping Hormuz closed so unbearably high for Iran that they'd have no choice but to come back to the table. And when you look at the sequence of events over these last several months, that's basically exactly what happened, just slower and messier than anybody probably expected going in. Now, let's talk about why Iran blinked, because I don't think it was one single thing. I think it was death by 1,000 cuts, and each cut on its own maybe wouldn't have been enough, but stacked together they broke the strategy completely. First, you've got the military cut, which is the loss of the mine-laying fleet, and the standing shoot on site order that makes rebuilding that fleet essentially a suicide mission for any crew that tries it. Second, you've got the economic cut, that $500 million a day bleed that doesn't care about ideology, doesn't care about revolutionary rhetoric. It just keeps draining the treasury every single day. The blockade stays in effect. Third, you've got the diplomatic cut, which is Oman stepping in as basically the only credible broker both sides still trust enough to sit across the table from. Oman has quietly been the adult in the room this entire war, hosting talks, carrying messages back and forth, and at this point their credibility as a neutral party is probably one of the more valuable assets in the entire region. And fourth, you've got the regional cut, which is the fact that Iran's own neighbors, the same Gulf states that are supposed to be part of this future administration of the Strait, are furious about the economic damage this has caused, and Iran cannot afford to alienate every single country around it. At the same time, it's trying to survive a war with the United States. So when you add all of that up, the blockade that Iran built to be its trump card, no pun intended, turned into the exact mechanism that forced them back to the table, weaker than when they started. That's the real headline here. It's not just that the U.S. military shattered the physical blockade, sinking the boats and clearing the mines. It's that the entire strategic bet Iran made, the idea that they could hold global energy markets hostage and use that as leverage against a superpower, has now completely failed, and everybody watching, especially other actors around the world who might be considering similar asymmetric tactics against the U.S. or its allies, just got a very expensive lesson in what happens when you try that. All right, let's get into the global roundup section because there's a lot connected to this story happening right now in the Red Sea. So while all of this has been playing out in Hormuz, the conflict has actually widened to include the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is the other massive choke point down at the base of the Red Sea. Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen have been threatening to disrupt shipping through that corridor too. And this creates an especially painful problem for Saudi Arabia specifically. Here's why. When Hormuz got choked off, Saudi Arabia had to reroute a huge amount of its oil exports through the Red Sea instead, using Bab el-Mandeb as basically their emergency backup route to keep crude flowing to global markets. And now the Houthis are going after that route too. In July, the Houthis announced they were closing Bab el-Mandeb entirely to Saudi-linked shipping. And just this week, they've escalated even further. On Wednesday, the Houthis claimed they fired ballistic missiles at a Saudi oil tanker called the Wafa, targeting it off the Saudi port city of Yanbu in the northern Red Sea. A Houthi military spokesman put out a pre-recorded statement claiming responsibility, though no hard evidence was provided, and there was no immediate confirmation from Saudi Arabia. Around the same time, UK Maritime Trade Operations reported a separate incident, a loud explosion near a tanker roughly 95 nautical miles southeast of Aden, Yemen. Crew members were all accounted for, no environmental damage reported, but it's still unclear if that's the same vessel the Houthis were claiming credit for. And just the day before all of that, Indian authorities confirmed that an Indian-flagged vessel had actually been struck and sunk by a projectile off the coast of Yemen. So you're looking at a pattern here of escalating attacks, specifically targeting the one alternative route Saudi Arabia was counting on to keep exporting oil, while Hormuz stayed shut down. Industry analysts have pointed out that this sharp decline in Red Sea export capacity removes basically one of the last remaining options the kingdom had to keep barrels moving. Some vessels have reportedly tried to sneak through anyway by turning off their tracking transponders, which tells you how desperate shippers have gotten to avoid getting caught in the crossfire of two separate blockade situations happening at the same time on two different waterways. And this is where I think people miss the bigger connection. It's not a coincidence that Houthi attacks in the Red Sea escalated at the exact moment Hormuz negotiations started moving toward a resolution. If you're Iran and your primary leverage point at Hormuz is collapsing, because your mine-laying fleet got sunk and your economy is bleeding $500 million a day, what do? You lean harder on your other proxy, which in this case is the Houthis, and you try to open up a second front that keeps pressure on the exact same economic target, which is Gulf oil exports, just through a different waterway, where you don't have to risk your own navy directly. It's the same playbook we've talked about before with Iran's broader strategy in this war. When the direct fight isn't working, you shift the pressure to proxies, you shift the geography, you try to make the overall cost of doing business in the region so painful that anybody, decides it's not worth it anymore. The problem for Iran is that this tactic requires the proxy network to actually hold together and actually deliver results. And the Houthis, attacking an already diminished flow of Saudi exports through the Red Sea, is not the same kind of leverage as choking off a quarter of the world's oil supply through Hormuz. It's a consolation prize dressed up as a strategy. There's also a coalition angle here that's worth mentioning because Saudi Arabia isn't just sitting back and absorbing these hits without a response. Patriot missile batteries positioned along the Saudi coast, some of them reportedly crewed by allied personnel from partner nations helping backstop Gulf air defense, have been intercepting inbound ballistic missiles and drones on a near-weekly basis at this point. Every successful intercept is a story that doesn't make headlines because nothing blew up, but every failed intercept becomes international news within hours. That imbalance in coverage makes it easy to forget just how many of these attacks are actually being stopped before they ever reach their target. And that matters for this story specifically because it tells you the Houthi escalation, as aggressive as it looks on paper, is running into the exact same problem Iran's mine-laying campaign ran into up in Hormuz. The attacking side can keep launching, but the defending side has technology and coordination on its side that's intercepting a significant share of what gets thrown at it, which means the actual economic disruption caused by each individual attack is smaller than the headline suggests, even while the political and psychological pressure from the attacks continues to build. That psychological pressure piece is actually the real point of this whole southern front for Iran. They know they can't physically choke off Saudi Arabia's Red Sea alternative the same way they were choking Hormuz. What they can do is keep the threat visible enough, keep tankers nervous enough, keep insurance premiums high enough, that shippers start avoiding the region altogether out of caution rather than because of any hard blockade. It's a cheaper, lower-risk version of the same strategy, just scaled down to match what's actually left in Iran's proxy toolkit after the direct approach failed. Now let's take everything we just covered and put it into the 4D chess strategic analysis section, because here's the pattern that connects all of this together, and I think it's the piece that a lot of coverage is completely missing. Iran built its entire wartime strategy around choke points. Hormuz first, because it was the biggest liver available, the one that could genuinely rattle the global economy and force a superpower to negotiate on Iran's terms. When that started to fail, because the United States systematically dismantled the mine-laying capability and backed it with a shoot on-site order, Iran didn't abandon the choke point strategy entirely. It just shifted the weight of that strategy onto a second choke point further south, using a proxy force instead of its own navy to keep the pressure on. That's not random escalation. That's a regime working through its list of available levers, one at a time as each previous lever gets taken away. And here's the honest assessment of where that leaves them. Every layer of this strategy requires physical assets that can be found, tracked, and destroyed, or a proxy network that can be squeezed through diplomatic and military pressure on its patron. Mines require boats, boats can be sunk. Missiles fired from Yemen require launch sites and supply chains that trace back to Tehran, and that supply chain has already been targeted repeatedly throughout this war. So what Iran is really doing right now is buying time, stretching out the appearance of leverage for as long as possible, while the actual substance underneath that leverage keeps getting eroded piece by piece. The $500 million a day drain doesn't pause while the Houthis fire missiles into the Red Sea. It just keeps compounding. And the moment Oman and Iran actually finalize this joint mechanism for Hormuz, which by every account is close, Iran loses its single biggest bargaining chip in this entire war. And it will be left negotiating from a Red Sea proxy position that's fundamentally weaker than the position it just gave up. There's also a broader signal here for anyone else in the world watching how this played out, because asymmetric blockade strategies against choke points have always been treated as this great equalizer, the idea that a country without a real navy can still hold global trade hostage with cheap assets and disposable tactics. What just happened in Hormuz is basically a real-time case study in the limits of that idea when the country on the other end has the intelligence capability to locate every single asset involved, the firepower to remove them without hesitation, and the economic leverage to simply outlast the other side financially. Iran didn't lose this fight because they lacked creativity in how they approached it. They lost because creativity alone doesn't overcome a $500 million a day hole in your treasury while the other side is out there sinking every boat you send to maintain the threat. And I think that's the lesson regional actors everywhere are quietly absorbing right now, whether they say it publicly or not. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we wrap this up, and it's the question of what a genuinely reopened Hormuz actually looks like in practice, because reopening a choke point after a war isn't as simple as flipping a switch back to normal. Insurance underwriters are going to want weeks, maybe months, of clean transit data before they bring war risk premiums back down to anything close to pre-conflict levels. Shipping companies that rerouted entire fleets around the Cape of Good Hope aren't going to reverse those decisions overnight either, because repositioning that many vessels back into the Gulf trade lanes takes time and costs money of its own. So even in the best case scenario, where Oman and Iran sign their framework this week and the mine clearing operation wraps up cleanly, you're probably looking at a gradual ramp back up to full capacity rather than an instant return to the 20 million barrels a day this strait used to handle before any of this started. That's actually useful context for understanding why oil prices haven't already crashed back down to pre-war levels, even with all this positive momentum. The market isn't just pricing in whether a deal gets signed, it's pricing in how long it actually takes for normal shipping behavior to return once that deal is real. So where does this actually leave us going forward? Watch the Oman talks closely over the next few days, because if that framework gets finalized and signed, that's going to be the real signal that this blockade era is ending. Not just Trump posting that a deal could come as early as tomorrow, which we've kind of heard before if you've been following this closely. Watch the CENTCOM daily updates on vessel numbers too, because if that number of ships crossing the strait each week starts climbing back up towards something resembling normal traffic, that tells you the mine clearing operation is wrapping up and shippers are starting to trust the waterway again, which is honestly the biggest indicator of all, because insurance companies and shipping conglomerates don't send billion-dollar tankers through a strait based on political promises. They send them through based on actual risk assessments. And keep an eye on the Red Sea too, because if the Houthis keep escalating there even as Hormuz calms down, that tells you Iran is fully pivoting its remaining leverage south. And that's going to be the next chapter of this story worth watching closely. What do you guys think about all of this? Do you think Iran actually follows through and signs a real long-term deal on Hormuz? Or do you think this is just another temporary pause before the next round of attacks starts back up? Let me know what you think. Down in the comments, I'd genuinely love to hear your take on where this heads next. And if you found this breakdown useful, drop a like on the video. It genuinely helps get this kind of analysis in front of more people who are trying to actually understand what's happening over there instead of just scrolling past another headline. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next update, because with how fast this Oman deal seems to be moving, there's a real chance we get major news within days, not weeks. And if you know somebody who's been asking what's actually going on with oil prices or the war in general, go ahead and share this with them. It'll probably explain things better than whatever they've been seeing in a 30-second clip somewhere. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.